Welcome to the Godzilla Vlogs, a podcast for everything and anything Godzilla. Here is your host, Adam Noyes.
Sorry, ladies and gentlemen, I was told that I was supposed to make some sort of loud noise when starting these podcasts to catch all of your attention. There, I have made it. And now I guess I have your attention, at least for a little bit, or at least for 30 seconds. Hello, everyone. This is Adam Noyes of AN Productions, and boy, have I got a doozy of a podcast for all of you today. Oh boy, this is something that has been building for a very long time, and I know I've been saying that a lot as of recently, but I mean it this time. And for a lot of those who are kind of close to me, those who are specifically in Geeks for Geeks, they'll know that I've been doing this for quite a while. They'll know that I've been sort of working on this, I've been piecing it together for quite a while. And I'm sort of bringing these findings out today. I feel like some kind of researcher. I'm not. It's actually kind of silly. Let's dive onto this before I start rambling on too much. And I've got a lot of notes. Usually I have about 4 to 5 pages per podcast of notes. This one, I have 16. So let's dive into this. And first and foremost, I love looking at different versions of movies. So much so that I've now done 3 videos, actually, on this topic, and this will be the 4th one. But this one, it holds a very special place in my heart, because it's actually what actually kicked off my fascination with multiple versions of a given movie. And it sort of started my fascination with structure, video editing, and understanding how a movie can actually be cobbled together. Because that's why I find different versions of a movie fascinating, is how it can change the structure and flow of a movie for good and for bad. And I can't think of a better example of how different versions of a movie can really affect the actual experience of consuming said movie, of being able to enjoy said movie. Ghidorah is a classic, and yes, I'm going to say Ghidorah because, quite frankly, I like saying Ghidorah. I think that's a really fun name to say. But it's a classic, and not because it Ghidorah the Three-Headed Monster is a classic, not just because it created one of the most iconic giant monsters of all time, but for its own place in pop culture history as well. This was the first all-time monster mash. I mean, what did they really have before, when you really look at it? They had the Universal monster movies back in the 40s? Come on. That was 20 years ago. But more importantly, this was the beginning of Godzilla's, his change. This movie was the stamp that really brought Godzilla into the pop culture light. It is this film that began that change from an allegorical destroyer to the savior of the planet. Quite literally, it quite literally takes place in this movie. Godzilla begins as a benevolent creature, literally, at the beginning of this movie. He doesn't give a crap about anyone or anything and just wants to fight Rodan. But by the end, he becomes a creature that saves the planet. Godzilla's the good guy here. In fact, this is the first movie where we actually root for Godzilla, and this is actually the first movie where he actually wins in the end. This is the first time he actually wins. Seriously, look back at the other Godzilla movies before this, and Godzilla never won. He never won. He was always defeated. When classic media released a lot of the original Japanese versions of the classic Godzilla movies on DVDs, it was this and Godzilla Raids Again. These were the 2 I just had to get my greedy little paws on. I just had to get them. I had no idea there was a different version of this movie out there, and I wanted it. I wanted my greedy little paws on it. You see, I used to have these 2 VHS copies of Ghidorah the Three-Headed Monster, and I easily wore those tapes out. Both of them. And then I would rent them from Movie Gallery, and I wore that one out as well. And I mean, I used to watch this movie all the time. I knew it inside and out. I knew the dialogue, I knew the music cue. I knew everything about the movie itself on screen. I knew everything about it. And in comes this version of the movie that's almost 10 minutes longer. Sign me the fuck up. Plus, I finally got to hear the original Japanese language, the actors' real voices, and no matter how good a dub can be, for a live-action film in particular, something will always be missing. Something will always be missing in a dub, no matter how good it is. It's that disconnect between the voice actor and the actual performances on screen. There's always a little bit of that disconnect. Das Boot, I want to point that out. Das Boot is actually a fantastic example of this. Even though the English dub is voiced by the actual actors who spoke in German, they dubbed it in English, the disconnect is still there. There's still something slightly off about it. So I find that interesting, and no matter how good a dub is, and I just want to say this, I think Ghidorah the Three-Headed Monster's dub is really good, there's no denying that there is a disconnect between the voices and what's actually being heard. But to compound my fascination and excitement for seeing a brand new version of Ghidorah the Three-Headed Monster, I listened to David Kalaat's audio commentary. And I'm not kidding, that audio commentary changed my life. I mean, my entire outlook on these movies in general, my entire outlook in their original versions versus their US counterparts, flipped. Utterly flipped, because I was one of those snobs beforehand, and it just turned over on its head. I used to bash the US versions like so many other fans do to this day. And I've done a full podcast actually discussing my sort of metamorphosis in the past, so for more information I suggest you actually listen to that. But it's important to bring up here. It really is, because unlike the other audio commentaries on classic media DVDs, David Kalaat's was the one to really get into the differences between the US version and the Japanese original version. David Kalaat even said he prefers the US cut made by Continental Pictures than that of the original Japanese version, which caught my attention immediately, and he said it was blasphemy, and he said he hoped to persuade us in his heresy, as he called it, in the audio commentary. Well, Mr. Kalaat, if you are listening, I doubt that you are, but in case you are, know that you have persuaded me in your heresy. I now, too, look at the US version of Ghidorah the Three-Headed Monster as superior to the Japanese one. And I hope to get more into that by the end of this podcast. Maybe not persuade you. I'm not trying to persuade people. I just want to present what I've noticed and present my thoughts on it, and really try to shed a new light on particularly the English version of this movie. So what are the differences between these two versions of the movie? There's not really big changes in it. That's the funny thing. It's not like the Continental Cut changed the plot, changed character names, changed the story in general. It's not like it did that at all. In fact, it's very faithful to Shinichi Sekizawa's original script. In fact, the only major change I can really think of, in terms of, the story, is they made the princess from Mars instead of Venus. That's it. And that's just a small change in origin. It's still a planet far, far away. She still thinks she's an alien. And so there's no real change to the overall structure of the story. The cuts made in the US version stem from two mindsets, and we'll tackle them individually as we go on. The first mindset of these cuts were to actually help the dubbing process. Because by 1964, Toho knew there was a massive market overseas for their sci-fi spectacle films, so they would often do their own dub job. And we know these actually as the international dubs, and quite often they're shit. They just are totally subpar on almost every level. Like, compare the international dub of Destroy All Monsters to the AIP Titan-Tetra dub of that same movie, and there is absolutely no contest. And I'll say that Ghidorah the Three-Headed Monster's dub is quite good. Belushi Studios, I think that's what it was called. Belushi Studios did a great job at pulling the characters out of the Japanese performances. And a lot of this stems back to that mindset that I am discussing. These cuts are trimming a few frames here and there, moving a reaction shot here to cover up some dialogue that won't fit the lip movement. And in the process, they make the dubbing a lot more cohesive and even matching. The next mindset is moving Ghidorah's appearance to earlier in the film. This is to give him more of a presence throughout the movie. So they rearranged scenes here and there, moved scenes to match here so they could change the structure of the film itself there and there. They actually made a much tighter movie in the process of that. I don't know if it was intentional or not, but they definitely made a tighter movie. Now, to be clear, each version of Ghidorah the Three-Headed Monster has its own merits. The Japanese version has some great character moments, such as Shindo and Naoko picking on each other, when they arrive back at the house, and it sort of establishes their brother-sister relationship and their antagonistic love for each other. But this version also has the added benefit of Akira Ifukube's music, the original score as a whole. Ifukube's music can be heard in the Japanese version, while a lot of cues are taken out in the English version, and Ifukube's score is phenomenal. And as I've said before, we also get to hear the actual voice actors on screen. Now, the US cut benefits from having a much superior structure. It fixes some genuine continuity errors, and honestly, it adds some music in places that I think adds to the experience, where Ifukube's score lacked. Now, before you hit the dislike button, before you freak out and turn this video off, if you haven't already, I will get into that later. I seriously will get into that later, because I can't state it enough that I think Ifukube's score is phenomenal in this film. And to be clear, and I'm going to say this one last time before I move on, there are pros and cons to each version of this movie. There are things in one version that I like against the other, and vice versa. It's Ghidorah the Three-Headed Monster that taught me the importance of structure. How a movie is put together scene by scene and shot by shot. Is this the best put together movie out there? No, far from it. But this movie taught me how moving a scene from point A to point B, or vice versa, can totally change the montage flow and emotions of a movie. Can totally change it. And this is where the US cut succeeds in droves. That will jump out immediately. 1. is Shindo's first scene. In the Japanese version, there is a dialogue scene between Shindo and a reporter that establishes that they are looking at the same meteor shower that Naoko is over at the observatory. It then goes into the princess plot. So there's a little bridge before the plot actually gets moving. This scene is removed in the US cut and jumps immediately to the chief arriving and Shindo getting his briefing on the princess. And 2, a shot is taken from the ending of the assassination scene with the princess, and that meteor crashing happens much, much earlier in the US version. And so Ghidorah's presence is felt much earlier. These kinds of changes are wrought through the US cut, and personally, I think it's all the better for it. Another example goes to Godzilla's character as a whole. When Godzilla first makes his appearance, which is totally badass, by the way, a shot is lifted from later in the movie of Rodan flying in the sky and Godzilla reacting to Rodan. So what does this do? The original Japanese version has Godzilla surface, then destroy the boat. Godzilla does not see Rodan until he actually makes landfall. In the US cut, Godzilla now has a motive. The US cut editors have made it look like Rodan is intimidating Godzilla, thus giving him a motive to actually make landfall and actually for them to fight. And inadvertently, they added more character to Rodan as a result. Now, this is a really small change, but totally shows how montage can actually improve the movie. It goes from the monsters doing, what monsters do, to actual motivations and even development. You know exactly what Godzilla is thinking earlier in this movie, ramping up the action and tension much earlier on than in its Japanese counterpart. The final one is a bit more in depth, but it's Malnus, his final shootout with Shindo in the ravine. In the Japanese cut, this scene plays out in order. It's a full scene that plays out with no breaks whatsoever. The US cut splits this scene up. And intersplices the final monster fight between Godzilla, Rodan, Mothra, and King Ghidorah in that sequence. It's interspliced in between there. So what does that mean? It does many things, actually. But most importantly, it reminds us that this story is interconnected to that of the monsters. Much more in the US cut. And then it also gives motivation for Malnus's death. In the Japanese version, Ghidorah's strike on the mountain with his electronic beam, his lightning or whatever, it just happens. It just comes out of nowhere and so on and so forth. In the US cut, what comes just before Ghidorah blasts the mountain is him blasting Godzilla in the balls. So it's now motivated. We see him blasting his lightning in every which direction, so it just happens to hit the mountain, killing Malnus in the process. And that's actually a lot more engaging in terms of structure. Everything is now interconnected so much more. We're seeing it, we're hearing it, and we're experiencing it. And I know this was the intent of the US editors because they did two other things in this scene. One, they added Godzilla and Rodan roaring in the background for the sequence. The entire assassination scene, they added in the monster roars in the background. Seriously, watch the Japanese version again, and it's so quiet. Too quiet, even. Isn't there a monster fight happening just, like, up the road a bit? You know, up the ravine a little bit? And two, this is the second chain. This actually serves as a bit of a segue into my next topic, but the US cut added music here that is non-existing in the Japanese version. There is no music at all in the sequence in the Japanese version. The Japanese version is just diegetic sound. Ifukube has no music, and the US editors added some creepy stop music to underscore the scene. And this music adds a lot of tension here. Especially when Shindo is shot, and it looks like Malnus is going to kill both him and the princess. They added a bass drum roll as Malnus stands, putting the audience on the edge of their seats, and then in the Japanese version, there's none of that. None of that at all. Ifukube's score for Ghidorah the Three-Headed Monster, I told you it was a segue, is so iconic. And it is phenomenal, especially when you know that he had to score 3 different kaiju movies in 1964. Mothra vs. Godzilla, Dogora the Space Monster, and Ghidorah the Three-Headed Monster. I mean, this man was the absolute undisputed master of making giant monsters actually feel gigantic. It's his music that did that. This was his genre. Even Masaru Sato would go on to say, with his scores for his giant monster movies, he said, my mission was to do the exact opposite of what Ifukube did. I could not sound like him because this is his genre. Now, at first glance, a lot of people have yelled and screamed that entire cues of Ifukube's score had been replaced in the US cut. Including me, by the way. I used to have this mentality. There are a few moments in the US cut where I wonder why they cut out Ifukube's music. It genuinely confuses me why they would get rid of this fantastic score. Much of the stock music they went with was being composed by Trevor Duncan and Anthony Bridges. David Kalaat himself does not defend these decisions, so those who think I'm just a fanboy of David Kalaat and will blindly bow to his philosophy, this is where I actually beg to differ from him. There are a few cases where I prefer the music chosen in the US cut over Ifukube's original score. The scenes where I've noticed that I've liked the music cues that were added in there are a few things that I've noticed that are in common. There's a common thread between all of them. So the music is helping to bridge 2 scenes together, or it adds a lot of atmosphere to the sequence. And we'll tackle the atmosphere first because, quite frankly, is the easiest to explain. And immediately, the scene that comes to mind is Dr. Murai's climb on the mountain by Kurobe Dam, where Ghidorah's meteor had hit. The music in the US version is so creepy and unnerving, while Ifukube's score is majestic and beautiful. So there are 2 drastically different tones between the US version and the Japanese version, and I prefer the US cuts, the music there, because of the sense of forebodingness that happens in that sequence. Something's off, and I think the music fits much better there than Ifukube's score. The characters don't know something is weird is happening too, and that adds some more tension, but the music reminds the audience that we do. We know that something odd is happening. The characters do not, which adds a lot of tension to a scene. Another example is Malnus and the assassins arriving in Japan. There is no music in the Japanese version at all. And the US editors added this stock track that's totally atmospheric and foreboding. And again, it adds to the atmosphere of the scene. I'm now tackling this because it serves as a segue into the next part of the discussion. When Malnus is introduced, the Japanese version plays the princess's theme nonstop, even as Malnus discusses killing her. There's no breakup in the flow, there's nothing. It's tonally off, especially since the music is so peaceful, and it's peaceful. The US cut fades into a crescendo track, building tension as the camera pushes in on Malnus, and he says, "The bomb is aboard the plane." Then a bass drum hits, and suddenly we're back to Ifukube's music. That's what I'm talking about, ladies and gentlemen. Now, strings like this are common in this movie, and a lot of it comes from how Ifukube scores his movies. Rarely did Ifukube actually compose his music to actually fit the montage of a scene, which is what composers usually do, by the way. Composers do this all the time. They'll have the movie playing in front of them, and they'll compose their music to match cuts, and fades, and transitions, even sound effects. But that's not what Ifukube did. Ifukube instead composed to underscore a given scene. And in many ways, it's similar to what John Carpenter did with his scores in the horror genre. They were always there to underscore the scene, not necessarily carry a scene. And many of the times, the US editors added in their stock music simply to bridge one action to the next, as I mentioned above. My favorite example of this is Godzilla's first appearance. The music score I mentioned earlier starts when the princess says, "That ship mustn't sail." Now, there's a foreboding, creeping, almost crescendo of music slowly creeping up, and as it cuts to the next scene. And now that's foreboding. And I love that. I frickin' love that. It also makes the whales look like they're running away from Godzilla instead of being a bit of misdirection as presented in the Japanese version. Another example is when they are about to shock the princess. They're giving her shock treatment. This is a perfect case of Ifukube underscoring because there's no change in tone or mode as the montage intercuts between Rodan picking up Godzilla, the assassin setting the voltage to 3000, and Godzilla getting his famous dick drop. The US cut fixes this and sort of meshes many different stock cues. My favorite being when it cuts from Shindo saying he set the voltage right, then immediately cuts to a shot saying 3000 volts. There is a bass drum hit there, and that adds tension to a scene. The US editors added that bass drum hit, and it sort of punches us. They have no idea what's going on. It adds to the tension of the sequence. The result is the audience feeling more on the edge of their seat as a whole, because the music is sort of matching that sequence. However, to defend Ifukube's score, it's quite good. In fact, I love it being used in this specific scene in the Japanese version. It's just the editing wasn't mixed well. There's no increase in volume to match what is going on. It just sort of stays at the same low tone throughout the entire sequence. So a lot of that I actually pin on the Japanese editors and not so much Ifukube. Another great example is a bridge that connects Godzilla and Rodan fighting to the Diet building. This too can serve as a bit of a segue to what I'm actually going to tackle next. Ifukube's music is replaced with stock music. They flat out just replaced the entire track. And it swells as Godzilla and Rodan continue their fight. The montage then fades to a shot of the Diet building as it crash zooms in. Now, I've noticed this a lot in Japanese movies. It's not just their kaiju or their tokusatsu flicks, but Japanese films tend to edit scenes and just that. Each individual scene is their individual scene laid next to another individual scene. Okay, what the fuck does that mean? Try to explain that, Adam. So here in the West, we like to bridge scenes with sound, music, effects, something. In Japan, to this day, by the way, if a scene ends, You'll often find the music of the scene suddenly stopping as it cuts to the next scene. All sound effects just coming to a screeching halt, and it just cuts to the next scene. You'll see that to this day in Japanese cinema. And some directors actually do this very well. I personally think Hideaki Anno is the master of using this technique in his works like Shin Godzilla and especially the later episodes of Neon Genesis Evangelion. He's perfect. He does a great job at this sort of editing. But oftentimes I find these edits jarring, even if they're not meant to be jarring. I find them jarring and a bit annoying. The Mysterians had this really bad. The Mysterians, when it goes from above, the ground battle above, to suddenly our hero sneaking into the alien base, the music starts, then stops. Then it starts, and then stops. The same happens in the Japanese version of Ghidorah the Three-Headed Monster. The US cut at least tries to bridge these gaps with specific cues from their stock library. I've mentioned some of these cases above, like the bass drum, or the crescendoing due to the diet building, or the swelling of a music cue when we are introduced to Malnus, things like that. And to me, that makes that version of the film a far more engaging experience as an audience member. Now, to be clear, several of these cues I thought could have been carried over using Ifukube's music, but we'll actually tackle that later. The final change that the US cut made in terms of music is removing the second time that Mothra's song plays, the Cry of Happiness, which, by the way, is my least favorite version of Showa Fairy's songs. It was my least favorite version of that. The Japanese version has this song play in full twice. The US cut says, okay, we heard it once, let's move on. So they replaced the second song with some stock music as the fairies make their call to Mothra. The result is about 2 minutes being removed from the movie. Now, personally, I completely agree with that decision, and it was something Ishiro Honda himself would later copy in another version of Ghidorah the Three-Headed Monster, which I promise I will get into later. Now, to me, this choice only eliminates some needless repetition. That's all it does, but also keeps the movie moving. So there, I tackled the music. But I mentioned before the importance of structure in this film, and this is truly where I think the US cut is superior to the Japanese version. Take everything I said before, and I can still say the Japanese version is superior. Now, I mentioned that one of two major decisions behind the US editors changing what they did was to make Ghidorah's appearance sooner within the film. They achieved this by doing a number of things, by changing the order of a number of scenes, some in which I defend and others I do not. The biggest thing they did is restructure a good chunk of the first half of this movie. Specifically, the middle is when they really rearranged scenes. In the process, they actually fixed a couple of continuity errors, but that's for later. I mentioned before, I stated before that one of the things that they did to really sort of kickstart this whole thing was taking Ghidorah's meteor, hitting the Earth, and moving it to just before we meet Shindo. The movie is full of cases like that. Before we get into more interesting ones, here's some of the smaller changes that I've noticed. They rearranged when Murai is on the mountain. They rearranged a number of times we see Murai on the mountain. This scene was later in the movie, and the US version moves it much more towards the beginning. In fact, the original Japanese version, this scene takes place right after Rodan makes his first appearance. We even hear a radio announcer giving his report on Rodan. That scene is removed. So what does this do for the structure? It establishes much earlier, again, this is one of the first scenes where we see the magnetism of Ghidorah's meteor. It establishes much earlier in the US cut that the meteor is growing. Ghidorah's presence is thus felt much earlier, much earlier, therefore kind of making Ghidorah's presence more prevalent throughout the entire film. This also fixes a continuity mistake of how many times Murai travels to and from the mountain. By pushing this scene forward, this makes it look like Murai goes up the mountain twice, and not 3 times, like in the Japanese version. 3 times is kind of a little ridiculous for how short of a period of time this movie takes place over. But the biggest structural change is when Ghidorah makes his first and most epic screen appearance, in my opinion. In the original Japanese version, Godzilla makes landfall and is annoyed by Rodan, followed immediately by the following morning, and Shindo brings the princess to the doctor's clinic. This scene is flat out removed in the US cut. The princess then makes her prediction that Ghidorah has arrived, and we cut to Ghidorah being born. The US cut does 3 great things in terms of pacing, structure here that vastly helps the actual construction of the film, the montage of sequences. The first is the US editors move Ghidorah's birth to right after Godzilla lands and Rodan annoys him. The US cut knows we are ramping up for the monster action, and so they pushed forward Ghidorah's birth to build on top of what was already being built upon. So while we are already excited about Godzilla and Rodan, suddenly we're immediately hit with Ghidorah on top of that, which is something more spectacular than Godzilla and Rodan. Another thing that this fixes is another continuity error. Godzilla lands at nightfall. The clinic is in broad daylight. Ghidorah is born at nightfall and attacks Mitsumoto City in broad daylight. There's a continuity error there. The US cut makes it so Godzilla lands and Ghidorah is born on the same night, and the clinic and the following scenes are simply the next day instead of it being 2 days. Now, Kalaat brings up in his audio commentary that some people say this actually weakens the princess as a prophetess. Yeah, I actually kind of agree with a bit, because I'll be the first to admit this. If I'm invested in what's going on, I'll overlook some inconsistencies. I really will. I'll look over a plot hole if I'm invested with what's going on. I've talked about this a lot before. So her previous predictions all happened before Rodan and Godzilla appeared. So by the rule of thirds, and what the natural progression should be, she should make her prediction about Ghidorah before he is actually born. And this is exactly what the Japanese version does. But man, the order of events in the US cut is just so good. I overlooked it. It's just so good. Again, a lot of it has to do with that ramping up of action before we slow back down. I just really love it. It's like waves, almost. Ghidorah is born. The princess is at the clinic. That is our scene order in the US cut. But the US editors did another thing to her at the clinic that just makes me smile. As I look at the montage standpoint, especially as I look at it from an editor's standpoint, it just puts a big shit-eating grin on my face. I edit a lot, in case you haven't noticed, so stuff like this makes my mouth absolutely water from a structural standpoint and an editing standpoint. The princess warns us of Ghidorah, and the doctor goes, "It'd be terrible if it arrives here." And coldly, the princess says, "It's worse, because he's arrived." Immediately, it cuts to Ghidorah's attack on Mitsumoto City and the police warning everyone that Ghidorah has arrived and is coming. Ugh. I love that jump cut. Smash cut! Suddenly, Ghidorah's attacking the city. I freaking love that. I love that edit so much. While in the Japanese version, it just fades to black from Ghidorah being born. Then it goes to the attack on Mitsumoto City. And the US cut just made the sensible decision to keep Ifukube's music, too. Ifukube's music is present in that sequence, and I love it. Mwah! It's so majestic, I love it. Now, the Japanese version doesn't have this. So let's review the order of events. Actually, let's actually review this. So I know this is a podcast, but if you could look on your screen for a little bit, this is exactly what I have been doing. So we're going to tackle the Japanese order of the scenes to begin with. Scene 1 is the princess at the clinic, her making her predictions and everything like that. And in this sequence, we also get the warning that Godzilla and Rodan are heading this way. So it cuts to Godzilla versus Rodan, and them fighting. Which immediately after this scene, King Ghidorah is born. Which is a spectacular scene, but King Ghidorah is born, followed immediately. Now, Mitsumoto City, after that, it goes to the diet building meeting, which is interrupted by a bit of Godzilla and Rodan fighting. This is 6 and 7. Now, it's important that we note these orders of the scene. We've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. These are 2 scenes, and the reason why I'm numbering them as 2 is because of what the US cut cleverly does. Now, after Godzilla and Rodan fighting, suddenly we cut back to the diet building meeting, followed by King Ghidorah destroying Tokyo, as always, followed by the fairies calling Mothra, and then finally Mothra heading off to try to team up with Godzilla and Rodan to fight King Ghidorah. Now compare that to the US cut, which starts as follows. King Ghidorah is born, followed immediately by the princess at the clinic, followed by King Ghidorah destroying Mitsumoto City, followed by the princess at the clinic again, because remember, the US cut took scene 1 and split it into 2. Alright, so scene 1 is now split into 2. It is now interspersed with King Ghidorah's attack on Mitsumoto City, followed immediately by scene 2 and 6. Now, why is it numbered like this? That's because this scene here is an amalgamation of scene 2 over in the Japanese version and scene 6 over in the Japanese version, which, if you notice, this version is 2 sequences. The Americans put one half of this fight here and put it over here in scene 2 and 6. Combine the 2 here. Followed by the diet building. Now here's a big change. The diet building is now one cohesive whole. It is now one entire scene. There is no blatant interruption of the sequence until King Ghidorah attacks Tokyo, which is where the scene is happening anyway. Followed by the fairies calling Mothra. Mothra heading to team up with Godzilla and Rodan. Now it comes to scene 7, which is the second part of that scene over here. Now look at that structural difference. And the American version is vastly, vastly superior. There's no break in the action. There's no point, because even the part here that interrupts the scene, it's when it's worse because he's arrived, smash cut, to suddenly shit hitting the fan, and then it goes back, and then suddenly shit's hitting the fan again. There's no massive break of action here. It sort of functions as waves. Ramping up and then calming down, and then ramping up and then calming down, and that's where the American version succeeds and drills into sequence. So I suppose you're sick to death, actually, of me defending the U.S. cut as the superior film. I suppose you're sick of me just defending that version and just poo-pooing all over the Japanese version. Well, let's look at some of the scenes that the U.S. cut actually removed flat out. Let's look at a couple of those. I've already mentioned a couple of them. Such as Shindo's original entrance, his first scene in the movie, or Shindo taking the princess to the clinic. But there are a couple of removals that I actually want to mention, and we'll tackle the big one first. Naoko's character is a bit more fleshed out and even respectable in the Japanese version of the movie. There is one scene in particular that shows a bit of her backbone, basically, and how well respected she is within her own workstation. The US version makes us think she was just handed the job of the Princess Prophetess story because, it's her job. We think that it's her job and she's just been handed it. But the Japanese version has a scene where she distinctly says she will take over the case and scoop it out for herself. Another scene I like is Shindo witnessing Dr. Murai dropping off Naoko at their house. Though admittedly, I like the scene because it actually clears things up. In the US cut, Shindo just arrives at the house and mentions to his mother about Naoko getting friendly with Murai. In the Japanese version, we actually see his reaction to seeing it beforehand, and it gives Shindo a bit more character, establishing visually of his antagonistic relationship with his sister. This scene also has, the scene in general of inside the house has a lot more playful banter in the Japanese version, with Naoko and Shindo bickering, swatting at each other with newspapers, and stuff like that. And all of that stuff I like. It's showing a side to Shindo that he doesn't let on in public, which in my opinion gives him a little bit more depth than what we see in the US cut. And I also think it shows that he has genuine affection for his sister, despite them annoying each other frequently, and I actually like the nuance of that. Now, I mentioned before, but there is also a scene of Shindo driving the princess to the clinic. Personally, I don't care much for this scene. It's short, and it only really restates the obvious. It kind of does the opposite of Shindo witnessing Murai drop off Naoko. In this scene, it's just dialogue that doesn't really need to be there. I find it much more effective just cutting to the princess with the electrodes strapped to her head, and the doctor examining her. I think that's much more effective. The same idea comes across without any dialogue, and I've always preferred showing, not telling. There are also a couple of cuts in Rodan's first appearance. One I like, the other leaves me utterly scratching my head. The first cut is Rodan roaring for the first time. The US cut removes this shot, and I see why. Rodan looks terrible. The hand puppet looks absolutely atrocious that they use in that sequence, and it's just awful. And I think Rodan deserved a bit better here than that. I know he's supposed to look goofy in the movie, but this is his first appearance, so I thought he deserved a little better than that. But the next shot I actually wish they didn't cut out, because it is a beautiful wide shot of buses driving away, while in the distance we see Rodan flying out of the volcano. Now, I love that shot. It's beautifully composed. I really don't know why the U.S. actually removed it. The U.S. cut removed it. I really don't. I don't see the justification in that. But luckily, we can see it in the Japanese version. Now, a few additional cuts also deal with the assassin's first attempt to kill the princess in the hotel and Godzilla making his landfall. In the Japanese version, we have Shindo and Naoko running to the window as they hear an explosion outside, signifying Godzilla is coming. And towards the end, we also see the assassins fleeing inside a car while Rodan flies overhead. Which that scene it looks kind of silly because they're all in a car while everyone is running around them and everyone's moving faster on foot. So why don't they just get out of the car and move on foot? But I digress. Because I like these two scenes simply because it connects the monsters and the humans a bit more. And that's about it. While in US cut, Shindo and Naoko and the assassins even, they could have been anywhere. They could have been anywhere. The same way, but in the Japanese version, Godzilla is now coming. Godzilla's right there, so we gotta get out. Adds a bit of attention to it all. Okay. Adam, breathe. My God, just breathe. Why do people need to know this? They don't, but I do. So that's why I'm making a podcast about it. And I'm not done. By the way, I'm not done, because there is another cut of the film. There's another cut of Ghidorah the Three-Headed Monster, which was released in the Champion Film Festival in the 1970s. Actually, it was 1969, but it was also played again in the 1970s. Alrighty, ladies and gentlemen, this concludes part 1 of 2 of this Ghidorah the Three-Headed Monster Japanese version versus English version podcast. Part 2, we will be discussing the Champion Film Festival cut of the film, along with the comprehensive cut. So, stay tuned there, and until then, everybody, sayonara.